In the winter of 1944, in a frozen attic above a bombed-out bakery in the Dutch city of Amsterdam, a American woman named Clara Mitchell pressed her hand against her hollow stomach and listened to the silence of a city that was slowly starving to death, and she had not eaten in 4 days, and she could no longer remember what it felt like to be warm, and somewhere far to the south. Allied armies were fighting their way toward Germany, but they would not reach Holland in time, and Clara knew that if she did not find food within the next week, she would die in this attic. Thousands of miles from the Pennsylvania farmhouse where she had been born, and where her mother still waited without knowing if her daughter was alive. Clara had come to Europe in the summer of 1939 as a young music teacher who had saved for 3 years to afford a grand tour of the continent's great concert halls, and she had been in Amsterdam attending a performance at the Concertgebouw when Germany invaded Poland, and suddenly the borders closed, and the world she knew collapsed, and within months she found herself trapped in a neutral country that would not remain neutral for long. And when the Wehrmacht rolled into Holland in May 1940, Clara became one of thousands of American civilians caught behind enemy lines, with no embassy to help them and no way home. But what happened next changed everything, because Clara did not simply wait for rescue. She found work teaching English to Dutch children, and she fell in love with a young Dutch musician named Willem van der Burg. And in 1942, they married in a small ceremony in a church that would be destroyed by bombs before the war ended, and for 2 years they lived in quiet resistance, helping to hide Jewish neighbors and passing information to underground networks. And Clara learned what it meant to be hungry and afraid, and to keep hoping anyway, because hope was the only currency that still had value in occupied Holland. And then something no one expected happened, because in September 1944, the Allies launched Operation Market Garden, the ambitious airborne assault that was supposed to end the war by Christmas, and for a few glorious days, it seemed like liberation had finally come as Allied paratroopers dropped from the sky miles from Amsterdam. But the operation failed at Arnhem, and the German army held the Rhine, and Holland remained occupied. And in retaliation for Dutch resistance, the Germans imposed a brutal embargo, cutting off all food and fuel shipments to the Western Netherlands. And what followed became known as the Hongerwinter, the hunger winter that would kill more than 20,000 Dutch civilians. The hunger came slowly at first, as rations were cut and cut again until a day's official food allowance contained fewer than 500 calories, and then the rations stopped entirely and people began eating tulip bulbs and sugar beets meant for cattle and grass, and finally anything they could find. And Clara watched the city transform around her as the elegant Dutch, who had maintained their dignity through 4 years of occupation, began to waste away their faces, becoming gaunt, their clothes hanging loose, their children crying from hunger, until they no longer had the strength to cry. What she discovered next would shake her understanding of what humans could endure, because Clara learned that survival in the hunger was not about strength or cleverness, but about small acts of impossible generosity, as neighbors shared their last scraps of food and strangers risked their lives to smuggle grain from farms in the east. And even German soldiers sometimes looked the other way when starving children stole from military kitchens. And Clara saw that even in the darkest times, when death seemed certain and hope seemed foolish, the human capacity for kindness could not be entirely extinguished. Willem grew weaker as the winter deepened, because he insisted on giving most of his food to Clara and to the Jewish child they were hiding in their attic, a 6-year-old girl named Sarah, whose parents had been taken to Westerbork, and who clung to Clara like a daughter. And every night Clara lay beside her husband, listening to his labored breathing and praying that he would survive until morning. And every morning she woke to find him still alive, and she would kiss his forehead and whisper that the Allies were coming, that liberation was near, that they only had to hold on a little longer. Behind these ruins a secret waited, because as Clara grew weaker, she began to write letters to her mother. Letters she knew she could not send, letters that she hid in a tin box beneath the floorboards, telling her mother about Willem and Sarah, about the hunger and the cold, about the small moments of beauty she still found in a frozen sunrise or a snatch of music played on a neighbor's piano. And these letters became her lifeline, a way of believing that someday her mother would read them and know that her daughter had not given up, that she had kept hoping until the very end. The worst night came in February 1945, when Willem collapsed and could not stand, and Clara knew that without food he would die within days, and so she made a decision that terrified her. More than anything she had done in 5 years of war, she decided to walk east toward the farms, where food still existed, to beg or steal or trade whatever she had left for something, anything that might save her husband's life. And she left Sarah with a neighbor, and she walked out into the frozen streets of Amsterdam, and she began the most desperate journey of her life. She walked for 3 days, through a landscape of death-passing bodies, frozen in ditches, and abandoned villages and checkpoints, manned by German soldiers who no longer seemed to care about anything. And she traded her wedding ring for a bag of potatoes, and her mother's locket for a small wheel of cheese. And when she finally returned to Amsterdam, her feet blackened with frostbite, and her body near collapse, she found Willem still alive, still waiting for her, still believing that she would return. And she fed him and Sarah and herself. And for the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe that they might actually survive. Liberation came on May 5, 1945, when Canadian forces finally entered Amsterdam, and the streets that had been silent with hunger exploded with joy, and Clara stood in Dam Square holding Willem's hand and Sarah's hand, watching Allied tanks roll past while Dutch flags flew from every window, and she wept for the first time since the hunger began, because she had made it, because they had all made it, because hope had been enough after all. Clara and Willem emigrated to America in 1947, bringing Sarah with them after learning that her parents had perished at Auschwitz, and they settled in Philadelphia, not far from Clara's childhood home, and they raised Sarah as their own daughter alongside the 3 children Clara would bear in the years that followed. And Clara never forgot the lessons of the Hongerwinter, never wasted food, never stopped believing that kindness could survive even in darkness. And when she died in 2001 at the age of 83, her family found the tin box of letters she had written to her mother from that frozen attic. Letters. I told the story of a woman who survived on hope when there was nothing else left. Her granddaughter published those letters in 2010, and they became a testament to the 20,000 Dutch civilians who did not survive the Hongerwinter, and to the countless acts of courage and compassion that sustained those who did. And Clara's story reminds us that survival is not just about food and water and shelter, but about the connections we maintain with the people we love, and the belief that tomorrow might be better than today. And that is why we remember Clara Rose Mitchell, the American woman who walked through a starving city to save her family, and who proved that hope is the last thing we lose and sometimes the only thing we need.